Thank you for inviting us to be part of this amazing day, and we've heard such fantastic reports of evidence. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about my background, as well as being having an active interest in music myself. I'm a social science researcher, and I've looked at arts and health for about 10 years now, looking particularly at music in a whole range of settings and contexts. So looking at music in cancer care, looking at music with young offenders, arts and mental health and wellbeing, and lots of different sort of methodologies and different kinds of projects. I've recently joined with David at the Centre for Arts and Wellbeing at the University of Winchester, and I've had the opportunity to be involved in this interesting study, a case study of dementia care in an acute hospital setting. Now, I just want to say a little bit about the background of this study in terms of it being a work in progress, so we haven't got final kind of outcomes to share with you today, but we have got some preliminary information, and we're going to be discussing some of the methodologies and some of the issues around researching a complex intervention with a group of very vulnerable participants in a complex setting, and using a kind of pragmatic mixed methodology. So that's the kind of introduction. So can I just press that one? I'll let David talk to this slide.
Thank you, Norma, and thank you, Live Music Now and the Royal Society of Medicine for giving us this opportunity. This piece of work was initiated by a collaboration between a district hospital and the Centre for Arts and Wellbeing at the University of Winchester. We wanted to understand the relationship between an arts intervention in a hospital environment. And the pilot study that was offered was actually on an acute ward with older patients with long-term conditions, many with dementia. A challenging environment for the hospital staff, and indeed for the managing of the environment at the hospital. The research question was, how do weekly hospital music sessions for people with dementia and their carers impact on health, well-being and the ward environment? His name's been mentioned 3-4 times, Teivo Sakomo in Finland. And his work in 2013 looked at work in mild to moderate dementia situations. This study is actually in an acute ward, and I think that's put quite a distinctive character on what we could do, how we could do it, and how the relationship would work in the hospital. It was tripartite funding, a mixture of Strategic Health Authority funding, who was interested to bring the university and the district hospital together. The Academic Health Science Network, who were interested in the cost benefits of artistic interventions in a hospital environment. And the Awards for All, which was the lottery funding, and that came through a regional arts and health network. The specific intervention was a 10-week program, is a 10-week program, it's live now. They're 50-minute sessions led by a professional musician, and we'll see his work shortly. A mixture of classical and popular music, and a whole combination of group singing and playing, plus improvisation and composition. And actually, his approach, the musician's approach, is something that we will focus on in the first part of the presentation. I'd just like to play you this, which is the musician Neil Valentine talking about how he starts a session.
I might start a session with a piece of music that I have been practicing. So it might be, for instance, this is one of the ones I like to play. This is a piece of Bach. from his unaccompanied cello suite, arranged with viola. For the patients and their expectations, it's very important, I find, to be a performer at the start of the session, because that's often the context that they understand.
Neil, a very able classical musician, but as you'll see later, brings in many different techniques, many different approaches in the work on the ward. If I can hand back to Norma now to talk about the way that we design the research and the methodologies used.
So this is a kind of feasibility study which uses a mixed methodology. We are using interviews and focus groups in the study, but it's also quite important that we're using participant observation, which is a method which seems to work well in this particular project, because people's capacity to undertake interviews and focus groups is maybe quite limited, but the observation I think is really important. David's going to talk a little bit about the quantitative side of the study, and I'm just going to take you through some of the findings from the qualitative. So what we're really looking at is a kind of qualitative study and a process evaluation to look at the elements of practice and how we might develop practice and ensure best practice in this kind of work in the future. We have gone to the National Research Ethics Service for ethics approval for the project. That's because of the high level of vulnerability of participants, some of whom aren't able to give full consent. So that has sort of created a kind of infrastructure around the project, which makes it feel much bigger than the actual project itself. But it's also a very useful process to go through in terms of making sure that all the issues of capacity are really considered in the research. So, in terms of actually I think we should give you a little bit more of Neil before we go, and we can talk about what he actually does. So, if we can... There's the technical one. Okay, so this is the hello song. So the sessions are
And then we will do always a hello song, which is based around the key of C, and the chord of C and the chord of F. And I'll sing it to you quickly. It goes, hello David, hello David. And we'll sing to each person around the group. That will stimulate engagement.
Do they sing? Do they sing with you?
We get a lot of singing, yeah. Gradually, in a large group, when we're singing to 10, 12, 14 people with staff included, that can be 5-8 minutes of singing the same simple tune round and round and round, and it can't do anything but get into your head. And when you're met with smiles every time singing to a new person, it can only get more engagement and more involvement. A very regular response is for a patient who may be struggling with dementia of some kind or confusion. They will be disengaged from the music session. Maybe they listen to me play, and then they'll kind of go back into themselves. And as soon as the name is sung, often the head will come up and the eyes and a smile will kind of break onto their face. It's something that's very pleasurable being sung to, your name sung. I don't know what it is exactly, but it seems to be very enjoyable.
So in terms of the observation data, as I say, it's still work in progress, and we haven't completed the data collection yet, but we have some preliminary kind of findings and a preliminary conceptual framework, which is looking at how this kind of project can have the best impact. So these are the musical activities that people will be involved with. So we've listening to music, so you've experienced Neil's kind of presence as a performer, singing, the very sort of tactile element of handling instruments, playing. He gives people a conductor's baton and asks them to move it around, and he plays a response. And then gradually people realise that they're actually creating music, and that's a kind of quite an empowering thing to witness. People use a basic song sheet, and so there's also an element of composing and making up songs or changing words and making up new verses to traditional songs.
So what about the possibility of being musical? For many of the patients, there is little communication. But what Neil does is to offer that possibility to engage with and be part of a musical intervention.
So in terms of how we might have made sense, or starting to make sense of the data that we have, we built on Norma's work, which is was written about in another context. So the kind of theoretical contribution is around the idea of musical affordances. So the idea is that there are possibilities, there are benefits. These are the possibilities that music can afford. And this framework is quite interesting because I've worked on this similar framework in another study, which you may think is completely unconnected with this study. So that was a 3-year study of the impact of music on young offenders in custodial and community settings. And you might think there are very few parallels between the two kind of studies, but actually there are some quite interesting parallels because they're both institutionally based. And the idea of musical affordances works quite well over both kind of settings. And I think the important thing to bear in mind is that we're not necessarily talking about a simple dose-effect relationship. So we're saying that there are possibilities, there are possible outcomes, possible benefits, and that obviously we need large studies to capture those in terms of outcomes data. But in terms of looking at the contingencies of whether or not a particular music project will achieve those particular outcomes, that's where we need more process evaluation and more qualitative research, and that needs to be conceptually guided. So this is a conceptual framework for really looking at effective practice, for looking at the risks and the possible negative or poor outcomes, the things that might get in the way of an effective music programme in a complex setting, which you can imagine there are many. So these are the kind of musical affordances or the possibilities that we've managed to observe through our kind of qualitative research. So the first one is around connection. So you've seen the Hello song. People are connecting initially with their own name, with Neil. Eventually they might start to connect more with members of staff who are with them or with the group as a whole. This is a very delicate, very fragile group. But you do see some moments of connection which are very powerful. And certainly the mood at the end of the session is often very different than the mood at the beginning of the session. You see aspects of expression. So again, we've talked about how not just creative expression, people starting to enjoy the process of making music, enjoy the process of singing, but also emotional expression. And that can be sad and happy. We've had moments where the musician or the group will be singing a song and somebody will comment that this is a sad song, or somebody might start to seem to be really sad or say that they're sad. And it's what you do in that instance. Do you immediately change the mood so that it's a more uplifting, more joyful kind of atmosphere, which is what tends to happen. And bearing in mind that this is a musician, a professional musician who's obviously very well equipped to do this work. He's not a music therapist, and we're not providing music therapy as such. This is a group-based music activity, which is open access to people who are on the ward. So it's not linked with particular individual care plans. It's very much for the benefit of the ward as a whole, including the staff. So in terms of that emotional dimension, there is a debate there about how far do we allow negative emotions to be expressed. Is there room for catharsis in this kind of project? Are we always looking to be uplifting and positive? There is something around empowerment. So we've seen people initially move the baton and just not really realise that there's a connection between that and the music, and when they start to realise that they can really make things happen. Similarly with the percussion instruments, which you'll see in a minute, people handling instruments, initially they might just hold instrument or try and investigate it, but eventually they might start playing it and playing it rhythmically in the group. So there's also something about skill, and of course memory. So there's something about activating memories, reminiscence, reminding people that things that they used to do in the past, things that they like, things that they don't like, songs, song verses and words of songs that people seem to be able to remember even when they have quite advanced dementia. So I think there are all these potentials, all these affordances, not to mention the benefits of staff who are absolutely behind this project 100%, and who will try and structure their working pattern so that they can be in on the day that the music happens, and it's described as the highlight of their week. So it's clearly having an effect in terms of staff motivation and well-being, which you would assume has a knock-on effect. So if we just look at give you an example of the percussion session, how it might work.
And all the time,
we also use other types of instruments like this chord. This is an African instrument, so a hollowed out shell, hollowed out seed pod with shells on the outside. That's very nice just to hold. So if there's again, it's also very loud for small movements. So if there is somebody who is not sure or slightly uncertain or confused as to why they're there, this instrument is very pleasurable just to explore. It's very, you can kind of get inside it, you can inquire about it, you can investigate.
The next clip is Neil, actually his concept of making music. Christopher Small's work.
Yeah, inclusive
musicking.
I'll try and take a seed from something that has happened or somebody has played. If no seeds are forthcoming, other things I might do is use a well-known piece of music. So examples of those are things like the Sailor's Hornpipe. And that's got a very strong pulse. That's one of the pieces of music that tends to get a very immediate, pleased reaction that you're playing to it. And we might just join in with the pulse with that. And that's it seems to work very, it's basically fail-safe. It's a foolproof plan.
So going back to our conceptual framework, we have these possibilities, these potential affordances, but they're mediated. And this is where the link with other kind of research projects is quite interesting, because many of these you could actually apply to the music in prisons project and music in other kind of institutional settings. So from a sociological perspective, I find that quite interesting. In terms of the critical success factors, if you like, clearly the musician and the energy and the skills and the values and the attitudes that they bring is absolutely vital. So we mentioned that Neil is not a music therapist, but obviously he is very well equipped and has been trained to work specifically with very vulnerable people. Repertoire is quite a big issue. So at the outset of this project, you might have thought that the most suitable repertoire would be familiar songs that people know already, because often with dementia, people are talking about reminiscence work, and there's almost an assumption that it's going to be about reminiscence. But what we found in this project, that there's scope for a variety of repertoire, there's scope for creation, there's scope for originality, there's scope for inventiveness. So it isn't just about standard songs, but it's also about creating new music and working with people to be forward-looking in their kind of musical identity. Obviously, the participants are an important factor in terms of their capacity to consent into the process, but also their attitudes to music, their previous experience of music. Something about group dynamics is really important. That can be affected by a number of different things. If a visitor comes and joins in with the session but they're not really into it, that can be drawing someone's attention away. All that has to be managed by the staff and by the musician. It is quite labour intensive, because Neil doesn't go in to do the sessions unaccompanied, and the staff actually want to be there, and the patients need staff to be there. So you end up with quite a heavy ratio of observers to actual participants. Sometimes we have to do something about that because it's a bit too much. Obviously, it couldn't happen without the staff. I mean, not only do they facilitate the music session, they have to bring the patients to the session. There's quite a significant additional workload, and the research project has added to that, I have to say. So there are some real complexities in terms of acknowledging the role of staff in really making these things possible in the first instance. And then there's the hospital environment and culture. So just to give you one example from our field notes, the music session was in full flow, and then a doctor walked in with an ear syringe and said, "I've just come to do your ear syringe." And there was a kind of sense that, well, the music group is not yet established fully in terms of the hospital, maybe in terms of the environment and culture. So those are some of the contingencies that we need to understand in terms of developing best practice. So I'm going to hand over to David now, because we've got a methodology here rather than findings to report, but I think we've included it because I think it's interesting in terms of the discussion about business and cost effectiveness analysis.
I mentioned at the beginning that one of the we have tripartite funding, and one of the funding partners was the Academic Health Science Network. We're very interested in that awful word, cost effectiveness. And that's something we were very interested to see whether we could explore in the relationship with the District Hospital Trust. It would seem that the collection of data in hospitals is mixed across the country. And in this particular district hospital, they'd set up some 6 years ago a data warehouse that was collating data, both from a business perspective, from the hospital's business perspective, but also clinical data. And we were interested to see whether we could access that data and look at that data during the specific period of the music intervention. So during the 10-week intervention when Neil was there, we wanted to look at, for example, the number of falls, the medication, staff absences, patients requiring specials one-to-one, average length of stay, etc. And to see whether there was a difference between that period of time and a similar period of time a year ago. Now, all you statisticians and health economists here will go, there's no way you'll get any kind of correlation. This is a pilot study. This is to try and understand the process of that data collection and data gathering and see how it relates to a music intervention. And I think what's emerging from this is some very interesting processes with which we could, with a larger trial and a bigger study, we could actually make some very significant correlations between these two sets of data. As Norma said, we're right at the beginning, so the data collection is just beginning. And I think in January, when this is finished, it would be interesting to see some of the data that we have. But at the back of it is this music intervention, and the qualitative data is very important. I did read a paper, Pluie and Home, about the link between the narrative and the fiscal, a paper from America. And that's very interesting, I think, when we can put some hard figures, and particularly in this capitalist world that we live, we can put some hard figures on that qualitative data, then I think we begin to get some very interesting levers, and which is maybe what some of your earlier speakers have mentioned. Yeah.
Okay, back to that. So we've just got, we'll finish with a bit of Neil, I think, but just in terms of the conclusions, I think we were talking here about a small-scale mixed methods study, but has some shown that music making can successfully engage people with severe dementia in a hospital setting. We will be hoping to look at some of these changes in the ward environment and build a methodological tool that we can use in future research. And I think what we've shown, so what we will be able to show, is a kind of situated understanding of critical success factors. Clearly there are limits of the study and there's need for further research in terms of outcomes, But also I think it's important to keep in mind the subjective impacts, the process issues, the role of staff in delivering these projects, and being able to, from these projects, describe the elements of best practice which will allow us to replicate the intervention. Because it's not enough to say, we know from this high-level research that this intervention might be positive, but we need to know more about the inside of what goes on in the process if we're going to really replicate that in practice, especially when we haven't got the resources to replicate huge studies every time. So we asked Neil
about success. How is success for him after a session?
I would define it by, you can probably see the difference actually by the amount of singing that we have for our hello song, to the amount of singing we have to the goodbye song or the thank you song, which is the same tune, but thank you David, it's the same tune but with a slightly different words, and that gives me a good sense of the increased engagement. Also, you can just tell from smiles and laughter, there's a lot of smiling, a lot of laughter, a lot of encouragement that goes on.
And then if we just give you this,
I would define it.
Next one, which...
Can I say something about this one? Because I do think this, some of the implications for this type of research isn't just about how we develop the health sector, because I think that is really important to do, but it's also how do we develop the arts sector so that we are able to interact with health in an adequate way. And most musicians' training, basic training doesn't equip them to do this kind of work. So you couldn't get someone from a conservatoire and just send them into a hospital to work with dementia patients. So what are the pathways, the CPD, the development work that needs to be done with musicians? I think Neil is obviously an example. There are other really good examples of this. But this was really just, we asked him the final question was what was in it for him as a musician. So we'll let the musician have the last word.
Musically, it's very satisfying. It allows me personally to use a huge range of skills that I have, which is you don't get to do a lot. So being able to use song, singing, composition, improvisation, facilitation, performance. All those kind of things in one kind of concise session is a challenge. It's very, very enjoyable and satisfying.
Thank you.
All right.